We had a really big week last week, trying to finalize, I guess, maybe not finalize, trying to get all the pieces into Go Crop and then moving through to look at all the various components that need to be aligned to make sure the plan is meeting the regulatory standard. So I know that was a big lift last week, and um, generally needs more time, more discussion, and more revisiting, which is why we have today class 5. And then we'll take a break next week. We have the no-till and cover crop conference in Burlington, and also the Vermont dairy producers meeting both next week in Burlington. Hopefully, if that interests folks, you're able to come. Maybe Susan could put the link in the chat, but two great conferences. We host the no-till and cover crop conference. That's on Thursday, which is why we're not meeting our last time next week. But we will follow up the following week, hopefully to wrap everything up. I do absolutely encourage all of you to wrap those plans up by that 6 week. I've I'm still reviewing plans from last year, and you don't want to be there. So let's try to get the plans wrapped up over the next. We have a couple of more weeks to get that done. Please reach out again if you're having trouble or you have questions. But let's make as much effort as possible to get the plans completed and reviewed and signed off on, so that you're not having to do that as we get into the growing season. All right, so there's nothing new necessarily in Go Crop today, but Lindsay is going to show off the record keeping components. Part of developing and maintaining the nutrient management plan is developing the plan and then putting it into place on your farm, implementing it, and then recording what you're actually doing, and then reinforming the plan. So it is meant to be an ongoing tool and process. From a regulatory perspective, of course, the requirement is to have the plan that meets the standard. It is to be updated yearly, which again may mean just updating it based on your records from this year, may mean taking new soil samples. Again, you need to have new soil samples every 3 years. It also should mean updating manure tests. So you should have a manure test every year from every storage that you have on your farm, so that you're keeping that information current. And so Lindsay will walk through adding records, which hopefully you'll be doing this summer. And again, people ask me all the time, well, do I have to use Go Crop to keep my records? And the answer is no. Clearly, you don't have to use Go Crop. If you have another tool that you're using, or you just like writing it down on a piece of paper or lots of pieces of paper, that's fine. Like, there's no requirement to use Go Crop. It is a nice central place to keep everything, and then to be able to keep that information over time as well. If you do keep the records in Go Crop, again, which we would encourage, they can be used to make your plan more accurate and update your plan over time. So it's there, and it's there for you to use. And like I said, Lindsay will show you that at the end of class today. As far as what we're going to learn about today, we don't necessarily consider potassium and micronutrients as environmental contaminants. So we don't actually um, have risk management tools for those like we do phosphorus or even nitrogen. We don't have major rules and regulations around managing those and how much you're putting on and when. But it's important for you because one of the goals, obviously, of nutrient management is growing high yielding and healthy crops. We want you to know about potassium, and it is a macronutrient. It clearly impacts a lot of growth and development of your crops. It tends to be highly limiting as well, similar to nitrogen, actually, in many systems, not all, but in many soil types throughout Vermont. So, it's definitely a nutrient you should be paying close attention to. It's easily lost in the system. So, like nitrogen, it's not biologically driven, but it can leach really easily throughout the soil profile. And if you're on light textured soils or river bottom soils, you're up in the hills of Vermont, the Newport area, that area tend to have low potassium soils by nature. And so they can cause significant yield limitations and quality limitations. So it's something we need to talk about, and certainly you obviously should be paying attention to. As far as some of the other macronutrients like sulfur and magnesium, we're going to touch on those today as well. And then there's a whole slew of micronutrients, some that we see commonly in Vermont as being deficient, and others we rarely see as deficient, but not to say that they can't be. So we're going to touch on those a bit too, and try to create a more complete picture for you around managing nutrients on your farm. Okay. Let's get into potassium. You know, I I was laughing the other day, mostly because I've been using the same slides for a long time, and I've tried to update them. But if it works, why fix it? They definitely could be modernized. I was looking at some of these the other day and laughing a bit, but I said, that's not that bad. But then I thought, we started this class in 2006. 20 years ago, we started teaching nutrient management to the farming community. And I will say that the first year we did it, we didn't actually have much presentations or anything like that because it was really just the most major undertaking to write a plan without using computer software. Everything was done by hand, and I'm sure many of you would still really like to do that. We had, these spreadsheets, paper spreadsheets, and calculators, and we spent a lot of time just hand writing everything into these spreadsheets and doing calculations to make the plan work. So we didn't have time for much else. And then as time went on, we started adding more what I perceive as value, which is trying to really teach people about why we're doing this, how the nutrients work, and how they get lost, so that you have a better understanding of why we're doing all this, and also how to manage these nutrients on your farm. So, you know, I appreciate the longevity of my slides, and it's not like fashion. It doesn't change every year. The information is basically the same, so I don't have to, um, you know, update the information. But anyway, maybe next year. All right, so let's talk about potassium. I got real fancy on this one. I keep laughing about these, but potassium, like nitrogen and phosphorus, we always hear about NPK, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, they're macronutrients. Our crops utilize large quantities of these nutrients. They tend to be limiting in our systems, and I would say all three macronutrients are limiting in Vermont. Some fields worse than others, but being able to add potassium to the system is important when you need it, and it's utilized by the plant in a number of ways. Um, it's a pretty simple nutrient cycle. The most complicated one, of course, was nitrogen, and again, that's because it's biologically driven. It's got a lot of pathways, a lot of um, forms and phases where other nutrients don't. They come from rocks basically, and originally they come from rocks. They get broken down from minerals and then cycled through the system. So potassium is really pretty straightforward. We get a lot of the potassium in our systems from animal manures and animal based type fertilizers. And that's where I would say the majority of you are getting potassium at this point. Um, and then there's still in many systems, like I said, a need to supplement the potassium that you're getting through the livestock manure. And there are a variety of different types of mineral fertilizers that are potassium based. Probably the most common one you've probably heard of is potash, right? 0062, but there's others. And then, of course, some people use wood ash as a potassium source, which is really popular and relatively inexpensive compared to other fertilizers. So again, potassium is getting into the ag system through livestock manure or through added mineral fertilizers. And of course, crop residues as well, but that tends to be a pretty small amount. In the soil, you have fixed potassium, mineral potassium, exchangeable potassium, and then you have this soil solution potassium. So the soil solution, it's a tongue twister. The soil solution potassium is where your plants are going to get potassium to be able to take up and utilize. And that's potassium in water, basically. And it's this K plus. So we've seen K plus quite a bit in my presentations. So we also know that K plus hangs on to the negative charges on soil, right? The cation exchange capacity. One of the cations is potassium, K plus, and it gets attached to clay particles, remember, or organic matter that has a negative charge. That's the exchangeable potassium, okay? That happens pretty freely in the soil where you have potassium moving onto and off from the exchange sites, okay, on the edge of clay and on organic matter. And honestly, what kind of happens here is the plants will take up the potassium out of the soil solution, and it creates a draw, right, from exchangeable potassium. So as soil solution potassium is removed, and it could be removed through leaching as well, or plant uptake, that creates a draw to move exchangeable potassium off from the binding sites into the soil solution. So that moves quite freely. And potassium, like I said before, also is held weakly, right? It's got 1 plus. So it's kind of dangling, I guess, off from the soil exchange site. So it does move freely, and it is easily lost to leaching, right? And it does have that K plus, so it can hang on to the soil. But again, it's loosely held, and it is prone to leaching. All right, so then you have this fixed potassium, which is potassium that becomes wedged between clay particles. And this is certain types of clays. Not all clays do this, but clays are in layers, and some have more layers than other, I guess, for lack of a better term. And the potassium can get actually stuck in between those layers of clay. And it can be moved. It can move off from the fixed area, but it's slow. And we wouldn't consider it like readily available potassium. And again, this is something we see in certain clay types. So we do see this in Vermont. We actually see it, um, in Addison County clays where we get a lot of potassium fixed between the clay layers. Then you have mineral potassium. So that's coming from rocks. Clearly, that's very slowly available, not something we necessarily account for in a year's time. But over time, right, as rocks weather, some of that potassium gets released and can be made available. Okay, so here's again a little bit about the potassium in the soil. So you have minerals, right? Rocks, most of that is unavailable. Then you have these 2-to-1 clays, and you see those little black dots. That's the potassium. And like I said, it's wedged in between those clay layers. It's very slowly available. You can see you get a very small amount of that. It does move, but again, it's not moving freely, unlike the exchangeable and the soil K that move back and forth quite freely in the soil. Potassium deficiency is huge in Vermont. I see it all the time. It's commonly diagnosed incorrectly, and most people think that it's a nitrogen deficiency. Anytime people see any yellowing on a plant, immediately they think they need to get more nitrogen out there. And generally, depending on the soil type, where you are, etc., it often can be potassium. And so it's just really a caution here that, look at your soil tests, look at the potassium levels, make sure that you're meeting the needs of the crop, from a potassium perspective. Don't always jump to the conclusion that it's nitrogen. You clearly could be just wasting your money, right? And continuing to limit yield potential. I don't know, sometimes I'm not sure if I say this enough in class, but you look at a soil test and you see a lot of things on there. We've gone over it, talked about a lot of this over and over and over again. But it's not, when you're looking at the soil test, you're not necessarily making a choice of which nutrient you're gonna work on, right? To be most effective and to get the best bang for your buck, and to get the most out of your crops, you really need to be obviously paying attention to all of it. And that can be daunting. It can look really expensive, but don't put all your money into nitrogen. And that's generally what people do without really considering everything else that's needed by that plant. So just make sure you're looking at it all and trying to meet at least the in-season nutrient needs of the crop. Potassium, most people worry about this if you have livestock from a really different perspective, which is on the herd health side of things. So potassium is linked to hypocalcemia and also hypomagnesemia, which are better known as, milk fever, and breast tetany, right? So, these are common ailments in livestock. Breast tetany is something we see in pastures in the spring mostly. And of course, milk fever is obviously related to the demands on a cow that has just given birth, starting to produce milk. But having high or low potassium feed can really impact the other nutrients in the forage. And this is, again, where we'll start to talk a little bit about how all these things are connected and why only paying attention to one can limit all the other nutrients, both with being taken up into your plant, um, but also overall limit crop productivity. Okay. Um, so we'll get into those relationships here in a few seconds. Now, potassium management can be difficult because most of what we grow are mixed stands of legume and grass. Okay. So if you're growing 100% legume, legumes require a lot of potassium. Okay. They do require more potassium than grass. And if you're growing alfalfa, I use alfalfa as the example here. Alfalfa is a potassium fiend. It loves potassium. It needs a lot of it to be healthy, to regenerate, to overwinter. And you know, if you're growing pure stands of alfalfa, you could have recommendations of well over 200 pounds of potassium to support that crop. So legumes themselves, not just alfalfa, require a significant amount of potassium to thrive and be healthy. And if one of the things you're struggling with is keeping legumes, right, in your field, it could be because you're not supplying them enough potassium. And I see this quite often where we struggle, often struggle to have clover, red clover, alfalfa, any of these things in mixed stands with grass. We tend to end up with mostly grass stands, which is fine if that's what you want, but we can't grow good legumes if we're not providing them what they need. And one of the things they need a lot of is potassium, as well as some of the other nutrients. So again, paying attention to potassium can really help improve legume persistence and productivity in your fields. Okay. Now, grasses, they also need a substantial amount of potassium, not quite as much as legumes. But the thing about grasses is that they are super competitive for the potassium, right? So think about the rooting system of grass. It's this humongous fibrous root system. It can go all over the place and get nutrients pretty efficiently, very, very competitive. Now, if you put some legumes out there in that grass, and even if it's a 50-50 stand, the grass is just going to be more competitive for whatever potassium is there. And so if you are low in potassium, if your soil test says you're low in potassium and you're not applying any potassium or not enough, right? And it's a mixed stand, the grasses are going to be able to get it far before the legumes. And therefore, over time, the legumes may die out, right? They're not going to be as competitive. They're not going to be getting what they need. So, you know, you have to make sure that you're managing potassium in these mixed stands to be able to feed the legumes, not just the grass. So again, when soil test is low, they're going to be more competitive. So you need to make sure that you're managing potassium in a way that you're going to be able to get enough for the legume. All right. So we didn't talk about this last week when we were talking about soil tests. And I showed you some examples of how the recommendations are made, right? Where we have these tables in a book, or we have these algorithms and a spreadsheet that essentially take into consideration how much is in the soil, and what that will mean for yield response, right? And for some of the nutrients, we looked at not using a soil test, but using crop yields and soil type or drainage class. That's what we do with nitrogen. But potassium We have to use a multitude of approaches because it acts very differently, right, than the other nutrients um, in its competition in the soil. So other nutrients are heavily influenced by potassium, and potassium is influenced by other nutrients. And their ability to make it up into your crops, again, is influenced by many things in the soil. So we have to pay attention to lots of different pieces when we're thinking about potassium. And then we use a multi-pronged approach to make a recommendation. Okay. Um, so there's three approaches that are used commonly when we're making recommendations um, on soil tests. And sometimes it depends on who you are and what approach you want to use. Okay. So the first approach is called the sufficiency approach. And the sufficiency approach is based on maintaining a critical level of soil exchangeable K. So we use a soil test, right? We take a soil test and we measure using an extractant, and you all know which one, right? Modified Morgan's. We use an extractant to look at the levels of exchangeable K. And so if we're maintaining, right, an optimum level, you remember this from last week, then we're saying that that's sufficient to optimize yields. And if we get below that level, we add potassium to be able to get back to the optimum level so that we're able to make sure there's enough nutrient in the soil to feed the crop. Okay, so that's one approach. Clearly, that's what we use at UVM. Okay, that's what I showed you last week. Then there's an approach called the maintenance approach. And I talked about this as well, where you base your crop recommendations on the replacement value of nutrients removed by a crop, right? So if you think about all the things you learned in class, we do use this maintenance approach actually when we're dealing with phosphorus, right? We do give leniency, I guess, in the regulatory requirements to add phosphorus based on the removal rate of the crop. We do that to allow folks to distribute manure on their farm and also to use the nutrients in that manure outside of phosphorus. Okay, so we do use the maintenance approach if we have to with phosphorus, but we do first say if your soil test says that you need phosphorus, that's what you base nutrient additions on, right? And then we go to the crop removal approach if we need to from a regulatory perspective. We also use the maintenance approach slightly, right, with nitrogen, where we look at the yield potential of our crops, but we also look at drainage type of the soil to develop a nitrogen recommendation. Okay? So again, with a maintenance approach, we're saying this was the crop I harvested. These were the nutrients I removed out of my field in that crop. So if you harvested a ton of grass, that would have 50 pounds of nitrogen, and it would have 15 pounds of phosphorus, and it would have 24 pounds of potassium. So for every ton, we just put that same amount of nutrients back onto the field. No questions asked, wouldn't take a soil test, wouldn't account, right, for anything in the soil. That's called the maintenance approach. And as I said, we don't like to use that approach can be very, very expensive for a farmer. Like, why wouldn't you just utilize what's already in your soil before you went and added more, right? But in some cases, we do use this approach from a regulatory perspective, again, to be able to add manure to fields, even though there's enough of phosphorus there. So you're all following me here. So we have the sufficiency approach, which is essentially based on a soil test and the exchangeable nutrients, available nutrients. And we try to keep those in optimum. As they go down, we say build that level up so that you have a sufficient amount of nutrients to grow a high yielding quality crop. With the maintenance approach, we ignore the soil test. We just look at the crop that you're growing and how much removal of nutrients. And then we just take that number and put it back in the soil through fertilizer and manure, right? There's a third approach, and it's called the cation balance approach. And we looked at this on the soil test last week, where there was the base saturation, and it showed you the percent of cations that were on the exchange sites, right? So calcium made up, in that example, it was like 91% of all the sites on your soil. And magnesium, I think, was 8%. And potassium was maybe 1%, something like that. And so some people will look only at that and say that calcium, we have to have 75% to 80% of those sites with calcium, 10 to 12% with magnesium, and 2 to 4% with potassium. And they will try to balance those ratios to those exact ranges. And there is good reason to look at the balances. And I talked about this a little bit last week. If we don't have a lot of cations and a lot of bases, then we probably have a low pH. But sometimes if these cations are severely imbalanced, they will impact the movement, right, of nutrients up into the plant. And so if they're severely imbalanced, right, like let's say we have way too much potassium, then we will take up more potassium into the plant, out competing the uptake of calcium and magnesium, which can lead to high potassium crops and can lead to ailments like milk fever and grass tetany, right? So if we know anything about animal nutrition and DCAD and balancing of rations, this is very similar. And therefore, to sort of ward off some of those same balances in the rumen, right, in your livestock, we try to manage that on the soil side. So we're trying to manage those cations just like you do in a cow's diet. We try to manage those in the soil so that we do get a balance of nutrients going up into the plant and we don't have too much potassium. That's actually our biggest concern. All right. So in any case, most cases we're trying to use a combination, I guess, of all of these to make a recommendation. But I will say in the case of potassium, we definitely use all of these to figure out how much potassium to put on the soil and also to make sure we're not over applying. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the sufficiency level, again, is balancing the nutrients so that we have a sufficient level in the soil to optimize yields. And if we're below that sufficiency level or above, it's a waste. Or it's a waste if you're above, and below, you're not getting the yields that you should be. And we really should be doing this, right, for every nutrient um, in the soil, because clearly one extreme or the other is either costing us something, right? Um, Environmental issues, we could just be wasting money and resources. And then on the other side, we're not optimizing yield and quality, right? And it actually could be leading to inefficiency of other nutrients. So the sufficiency approach is critical. We want to take a soil test and understand what's available in the soil, and then bring that up to optimum to be assured that there's an adequate level to optimize yield. Okay, so why do we not want to use the maintenance approach? We do look at yields when we're making potassium recommendations, but it's not, we don't want to use that as the driver to apply potassium. So again, when we have optimum levels of potassium, we know that we're gonna have enough for optimum yield, whatever the yield goal is that we have. Okay. But potassium is a nutrient that plants will luxury consume. Okay. So if we have an excess of potassium, plants will consume more than what they are required for optimum growth. So if you have too much too much potassium, okay, the plant will take up what it needs for optimum growth, but then actually it will just keep taking it up. Okay? So you could end up with a plant that has potassium concentration of 6%. So let's say it removed 250 pounds of potassium across the growing season, right? And you use the maintenance approach, you would put that 250 pounds back on the soil. But what you weren't thinking about was that that plant actually took up far more than it actually needed, right? So the plant only needed 100 pounds, but it took up an extra 150. So if you did use that to calculate fertilizer rates, you would be over applying again, right, of what the crop actually needs to grow. So with potassium, we have to be really careful because it will suck up what is there and it doesn't know when to stop, right? So we definitely would not want to use the maintenance approach solely in managing potassium on our fields. Okay, using exchangeable potassium from a soil test is the primary mechanism that we want to use here, okay, because it's accounting for what's there. And if you're keeping it in the optimal range, the crop hopefully is getting what it's needed and not luxury consumed. Okay, so here's just an example of that. If you looked at alfalfa as an example, and it had 2% K, then the removal would be 240 pounds of potassium or 48 pounds per ton. Okay? And if you measured the crop and it had 3% K, then you would be removing 300, or you would, yeah, be removing 300 pounds of potassium or 60 pounds per ton. So you only want the forage really to be, around 2%. Okay. So again, you wouldn't want to just add back 300 pounds because that's what you took off. You got to really be thinking about what it was that the crop really needed to produce that 5-ton yield. Okay. Potassium's easy, generally easy to get. organic and conventional. Again, manure is a great source of potassium, but not always enough. And also, if you're limited in what you can apply because of phosphorus levels, let's say, then you may not be able to get all of the potassium you need from manure. Also, because potassium leaches so readily and also gets taken up so readily, when you're using manure, you can't always split the applications, which sometimes is what's needed to get the crop the amount of potassium it needs throughout the season. So there are some limitations with manure, but there's commercial fertilizers available, both organic and conventional. The most common, of course, is muriate of potash, but there are numerous other sources as well. Again, conventional and organic. I will say a very, very common source of potassium that's used widely in Vermont is through wood ash. Wood ash, if people are using it, usually once they use it, they always say, wow, I couldn't believe how much clover was out there after I used that wood ash. Or the white clover, the red clover, whatever it is. It was really, there was so much of it, I couldn't believe it. And again, you're adding potassium, which the legumes may have been lacking. You're adding calcium, right? You're liming when you add wood ash. You're adding magnesium, so you're adding a bunch of bases, creating a pH, hopefully that's more in line with what a legume needs. Remember, legumes need higher pHs. And then the great thing about wood ash, which we'll talk about again in a minute, is that it's chocked full of micronutrients. Many of micronutrients that are limiting here in Vermont, boron being one of those, and boron, manganese, and molybdenum are all in wood ash, and they're all generally, in high need by legumes. And boron in particular is usually lacking in our soils. So wood ash is, in many ways a complete fertilizer for legumes, which is why they respond so well once you add it. All right. So we do encourage split applications of potassium. Again, it will help to reduce luxury consumption, which is a huge issue. And if your soil test says you need 200 pounds of potassium, you put it all on at once, the crop is going to try to take it up. But if you're harvesting across the season, taking 5 cuttings of grass, you don't want the grass to take it all up on the first cutting or second cutting. Whenever you're adding it, it'll be a waste, right? The third cutting won't have what it needs to grow. The other thing, again, with potassium is that it's susceptible to leaching. So split applications can help reduce that. And generally, we would put a first application of potassium on if you're purchasing it after first cut. We do see a flush of potassium come out of soils in the spring. So we tend to have the highest levels of potassium in first cut in the spring. And then after that, we see declining levels again. So applying potassium after first cut is usually advised. And then again, after a late summer harvest, especially for legumes. Okay. If you're liming, liming can increase exchange sites on organic matter and clay. And so then, you can increase the potential for exchangeable potassium when you're liming. We've talked about that already. So the mineral level of potassium, as I just mentioned, generally goes down after first cut. And so to the left here, you can see this is the mineral level of potassium, calcium, sodium, magnesium in the forage being harvested. So Potassium levels tend to be the highest in the first cut, and then they tend to go down throughout the season. Some of that has to do with that spring flush. And when you have a lot of potassium in the spring, potassium, if it's in abundance, will outcompete the other bases, calcium, magnesium, and sodium, going into your plant. So as the potassium levels go down in the soil, the levels of the other nutrients go up because the competition isn't as great. Okay. So again, as you increase the amount of exchangeable potassium and you're adding more through fertilizer, right? You have to be really careful to be paying attention to calcium, magnesium. We don't measure sodium per se, but the other bases in the soil because they do compete with each other to be taken up by your plant. Now it's interesting, calcium and magnesium have stronger hold on the soil than potassium, but as far as moving into the plant, if there's more of the potassium, the plant's going to take up more of it. So, that's why we want to use split applications. That's why we want to keep these nutrients in balance because you need calcium in your feed, you need magnesium, you need sodium, and you need potassium as well, but you don't want an overabundance of it. So in this particular slide, it's showing adding additional potassium and the effect that that has in the uptake of the other nutrients. Okay, so again, managing potassium is really important to keep your forage nutrients in balance as well. One of the pieces I think I mentioned with nitrogen cycle, maybe not, is that nitrogen and potassium themselves also are in competition to be taken up into the plant. So you really have to be balancing both of these to have the most efficient uptake. So, back to my point of if you're only focused on nitrogen, but you're limited in potassium, you're not going to get the yield gain that you were hoping, right? You're going to get the best yield gain where you're measuring the needs of nitrogen with the needs of potassium, and you're not overdoing one or the other because you don't see the crop response when you do that. Okay, so managing both nitrogen and potassium is critical for the efficiency and utilization of both nutrients. All right. So again, managing potassium levels in forage, we talked about a few key things. Again, it's difficult because plants luxury consume potassium. So, we only need potassium to be a little over 2% of dry matter for optimum growth in the plant, but oftentimes we see levels of 4%, and that just means there was too much potassium available at that time. So this is something we really have to manage to make sure, we're not wasting money, nutrients, and then also creating forages that could be harmful to our animals. So the more mature a plant is, the lower the potassium level, but, we usually don't want to be harvesting too mature feed. Sometimes people will, and that'll be dry cow feed, obviously. So the stage of maturity and the time of year already talked about. Early harvested spring feed can be very, very high in potassium because of that flush. If that spring feed is, a little more mature, then the potassium levels basically kind of get spread out over more plant biomass. So these things matter if you're trying to manage potassium. Of course, like I said, very lush forages like pasture and also legumes and even grass again. can be quite high. We want to keep those, around 2%. Corn silage certainly, is generally not an issue at all. Does forage species matter? It might. I think it really depends. There's a lot to unpack there. I think really the maturity of the crop and how the crop is fertilized is probably more important than what species you're growing out there. And so to reduce the risk, of course, of grass tetany, which is often seen in the spring, again, when cows are first put out to pasture, it's a lack of magnesium in the feed. So, like I said before, if your soil test says you need magnesium, put magnesium down. There's a reason it's saying that. We don't see it that often, so when we do see it, it's definitely a caution. Get magnesium out there. Look at the other bases, because if you're low in magnesium or high in magnesium, it can cause metabolic issues. Okay, so yeah, this is grass tetany is something we see on pastures in the spring. And again, it's low magnesium in the forages they're eating, which is likely a result of either low magnesium in the soil or too high a potassium in the soil, meaning it's out competing magnesium at that time. Okay. So just pay attention to magnesium, pay attention to the potassium levels as well. These are just some tips that we already talked about, basically splitting potassium applications, liming, adding dolomitic lime if you need magnesium, and obviously supplementing, especially on pasture. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking about potassium again. Really important to manage potassium from a herd health perspective, and also yields and quality. And potassium itself is often at odds and competition with other bases. So making sure magnesium and calcium levels are in line and balanced are really important, again, to optimizing crop productivity and animal health. All right, so I'm going to quickly talk about secondary nutrients and micronutrients. People always ask me about them, and we don't tend to focus on them all that much, maybe not enough. And part of that is because we don't see a lot of micronutrient deficiency per se. And with manure, especially on farms that are adding manure, there tends to be a lot of micronutrients in manure. So if you're giving your cattle micronutrients, it makes its way in undigested feed as well into the manure. And I think we've relied on that assumption for a really long time. There are certain micronutrients, I already mentioned those, boron in particular, zinc's another one, that we have seen frequent deficiencies, and we do provide recommendations on those. But there are many cases where micronutrients can be deficient, and you should know about those situations and think about whether or not you want to be adding micronutrients to the soil. I will say we have seen responses when we do add micronutrients in certain situations. And again, so I'll highlight those, and if you have any questions, happy to talk about that. So again, primary nutrients, secondary macronutrients. We've talked about these quite a bit, calcium and magnesium. We have not talked about sulfur, but we will here. And then the micronutrients. These are the plant available forms that your crops are going to take up. So similar to the other macronutrients, there's certain forms that the plant can utilize. And the needs of the crops vary. So you can see legumes have high affinity for boron and grasses don't, right? So you don't want to put boron necessarily out on grass, unless obviously it was needed. Manganese, again, certain crops need high levels of manganese. Soybean is one. I have seen manganese deficiency in Vermont. And then zinc, corn is a particularly high user of zinc, and we've seen deficiencies in Vermont. Molybdenum, again, is utilized by legumes. It's one of the components of the bacterial association, so very important there. And then, certain vegetable crops that need high levels of copper and other nutrients. So crops do differ in, their need for certain micronutrients. They're critical. We've already talked about this. You don't need a lot of them, but you need them. Doesn't mean you don't put them on if needed. So, really essential to critical plant functions, just trying to highlight that here. And if you don't have them or enough of them, you're going to have issues, right? You're going to reduce crop productivity. With micronutrients, again, they're needed in such small amounts. You have to be really careful when you're putting on a macronutrient. You've seen on your soil tests where we're asking you to put on 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 50, 60 pounds. With a micronutrient, you're talking about a pound or less sometimes per acre. How do you put a pound of material evenly, right, on an acre of land? And that's where it gets a little difficult when you do need micronutrients, to figure out how you're going to carry them out into the soil. So using something like wood ash can be a great way to supply micronutrients. So how do you diagnose issues? Now, soil tests, like I said, we do make zinc and boron recommendations. We can make a manganese recommendation. Plant analysis, I would say, is the common form, and usually isn't done until people see actual problems, right? But soil tests are generally not how micronutrient needs are diagnosed. And I would say most of that, would come from plant analysis or tissue testing. And usually we don't do that until we see a problem. So, when do you apply micronutrients? Just some like more practical recommendations. You would apply them if the crop requirement is high, right? And the soil test is low. Now, you've seen our soil tests. They say they don't show you necessarily sufficiency levels, right? At all. They show you averages, state averages. So our soil tests don't necessarily, again, recommend micronutrients with the exception of zinc and boron. So if you are growing a crop that we know has a high affinity for one of the micronutrients, that's something we should be considering and talking about. Again, we don't see a lot of issues generally, but we do recommend micronutrients and some of the secondary nutrients in Vermont quite regularly. Okay. Sulfur, this sort of ebbs and flows. I feel like it is a secondary macronutrient that's required. There's a lot of conversation about sulfur needs, especially as acid rain. Does anybody remember, acid rain? I think I did a paper on acid rain when I was a freshman in high school or maybe 8th grade or something. It was killing the top of Mount Mansfield. And then, we cleaned up a bunch of environmental things, and the amount of sulfur now being deposited throughout the country really is far less because we've done this great job of managing sulfur contamination into the environment. So there has been a lot of conversation around, well, should we be adding sulfur now? Sulfur commonly, in Vermont would be added through certain fertilizers, but again, not in organic production necessarily. Sulfur is gonna, be most limiting in sands or very low organic matter soils, and then sometimes can be limiting in cold and wet soils. So this is the same for other nutrients that we are concerned with here, micronutrients like boron and zinc. If you have sandy soils that haven't had a history of organic amendment, it is definitely possible that you also have very low other minerals and micronutrients, and that adding a micronutrient pack could be very beneficial. But again, that's something we'd want to talk about together if you are feeling like you need to do a little more in this space. Those are scenarios where we would really start considering this. On the flip side, something like manganese can become deficient. It can get tied up basically in clay, really high pH soils. Remember, we talked about pH and nutrient availability. Soils with really high organic matter, cold and wet. Where I have seen manganese deficiencies have been in Addison County on heavy clay soils with pHs over 7.5. And so in those cases, it was being tied up. And we did end up having to apply some manganese on soybeans, right? So soybeans are a crop that had high need for manganese. And under these conditions, we saw manganese deficiencies. So again, it's not to say that we shouldn't be adding micronutrients, but we need to consider the background of the field, the crop, and also look at what we're seeing in the soil. Okay, magnesium deficiencies, we do see these in Vermont. They can be quite vibrant, as you can see here, if the deficiencies are quite strong. Sometimes we see deficiencies in corn. I've seen it quite a lot. And again, some of this has to do with potassium levels. So remember what I said, when you have really high soil exchangeable K, and you may have low magnesium, you may end up with a deficiency because your potassium levels are too high. So again, looking at your soil test, if you're seeing something like this, again, it could be because of that imbalance. If you have a magnesium recommendation, follow it. All right, we already talked about this and that competition to move up into your plant. So it is something that we have to manage. We just talked about the same thing. Okay, and this too. All right, so let's move on. Sorry, this is a repeat of that, to sulfur deficiencies. It does look similar to a nitrogen deficiency. You have to, know what you're looking for. It does generally start on younger leaves, which is different than nitrogen, but you can see sulfur deficiencies again on sandy soils, low organic matter, lots of rainfall, no manure, or very little. So we do have some of these situations in Vermont, and we will see some of this time to time. So again, if you're working in these kinds of situations, just looking at adding a micronutrient pack is likely a good idea. Sulfur can be hard to manage. It's kind of like nitrogen. It does have different forms. It does carry a negative charge. It can move around. It can be impacted by the microbes, so on and so forth. So it can be a little difficult to manage, but I do think that once you have a scenario like sandy, low organic matter, low manure, all of these micronutrients and secondary macronutrients should take some priority for you. All right, we already talked about this. Same thing I just said, just making sure that you're paying attention to some of these other nutrients, especially if you're on really light textured soils with low organic matter. There are tissue analysis for sulfur that are, well vetted and can be used. And so if you are concerned about this, easy enough to go out and take a tissue sample and send it in for analysis. Make sure you're where you need to be and be adding, if you're not, of course. You do have to be careful with sulfur and how you add it. It clearly can acidify the soil pretty quickly, depending what form you're using. So you've got to be balancing all the nutrients again. Zinc deficiency in corn, it's an occasional problem here. We do run into it. Some people just add zinc in their starter fertilizer, but really it should be based on need. Again, when we have soils that were more acidic and then lined, you can run into a zinc issue. When the soil test is really high in phosphorus, you can run into a zinc issue. Cold weather, again, no manure or very little, you can run into a zinc issue. You can make a zinc recommendation using UVM data, and if you think or if you're growing corn, it's easy enough to do. It's not in Go Crop, so you do need to do that outside of the program. So happy to help folks with that if needed. Oop. All right. Already talked about this. There's a picture of zinc deficiency in Vermont. So again, it does happen here. Let's see. Just some information on what happens to the plants and how they grow. It's funny, you can go out in the field and you see stripes everywhere, and immediately people think they have a zinc deficiency. So, I would say call somebody if you're not sure. And again, we can look at your soil tests. You can look at the plants, etc., and really figure out if that's the issue. There are conditions, like I said, when we know it could definitely pop up. So we'd be looking for that as well. All right, so boron is a big one for Vermont. If you have a soil test and you're growing legumes predominantly, it's going to tell you add boron. You've probably seen this out in the fields. It's kind of red clover leaves, etc. A lot of the times those are boron deficiencies. We do see it again more on soils that are lighter textured, less manure applications or high pHs. Any of those things can really drive boron deficiencies. So we do have a blanket recommendation in Vermont to put on 1 to 2 pounds of boron, especially in stands that are predominantly clover or legume. Okay. Yeah, they're common. We see them every year in fields. You do have to be careful. We also see a lot of leafhopper issues in Vermont. I've seen quite significant issues with leafhoppers every couple of years. It is different, and leafhoppers make this injury called hopper burn, which is more of a V-shaped necrosis, tends to be more yellow, where boron deficiencies are more along the whole margin and tend to have some red and yellow, but easily confused. Okay, so with boron, again, we have a general recommendation if you have significant legumes and Also, especially if you're under some of these conditions like low organic matter, highly leachable soils, we would definitely be recommending, if you are using wood ash, it has a lot of boron in it. It's perfect again for legumes. All right. Manganese, I touched on this. I'm not going to spend much more time on it, but it is an issue we've seen in soybeans, can see it in small grains. I have not seen it in small grains here, but I definitely have seen it in soybeans. This is something I've seen in Addison County on really alkaline soils, high organic matter, um, and I've seen it in the spring. So, you know, I think it is something that occurs here and something to look out for. All right. Here's some pictures of what it looks like when you see manganese deficiencies. Oftentimes it looks like a lot of other things. So it's important to get somebody out there to see, help you identify with these kinds of deficiencies. If you see them, it's definitely going to be most easily treated through a foliar application. Okay, I'm not going to get into that. We have other micronutrients where you can see deficiencies, iron deficiencies. Again, you know, you might see these in really high pH soils. So it's not unheard of, but, you know, it can happen. And again, I would just be thinking about the conditions we're talking about and where we're most likely going to see those issues. All right. So just in general, maintaining that pH, like we talked about before, to be slightly acidic will definitely also generally supply adequate amounts of micronutrients, so it won't be toxic, won't be tying them up. Drainage, of course, can help in some cases where we see micronutrient issues in those poorly drained soils. And when you are returning plant residues and animal or livestock manure to the soil regularly, we generally see less deficiencies. So again, you know, we do have less livestock operations in Vermont. We do have more farms turning to row crop production. And so as you know, the amount of manure that goes onto the fields declines, some of these things may become more predominant in the landscape. So looking out for them is important. All right, so just ending on this graph again, focused on pH and trying to hit home one last time, you know, getting that pH where it needs to be for optimum nutrient availability is critical, can really help make sure your crops are getting what they need, keeping the microbiology happy, and actually reducing wasteful fertilizer applications. So just one last plug there. All right, so we did it. Stop sharing. All right. So that's a lot. I know we've gone through it all now. I think you've learned a lot. I don't know how much you were able to retain because it's been so much and like a fire hose. But we'd welcome you back next year if you want to go through it all over again. We have had people take this class like three times, and each time let us know, wow, I actually got it this time. So we realize it's a lot of information, and hopefully you get a few nuggets out of it to help build your plan and manage nutrients on your farm a little bit better. I think with that, we'll take a short break, and Lindsay can get on and talk about record keeping, and then you can get back to your plans, trying to wrap those up.
In GoCrop, hopefully you're pretty familiar with it by now, but to get to GoCrop, you can type in www.gocrop.com. You're going to click the login button. You're gonna type in your username or your email and your password. I'm gonna log in and wait for your farm to load. In my account, I have 3. You most likely have 1. And I'm gonna wait for my 2026 class to load here, because that's the one that I want to use today. So today we'll go over record keeping, and there are 2 places to enter records into GoCrop, or 2 main places, I should say. Once you choose a plan, you'll see on our left that we've got these 3 tabs, planning, records, and assets. We've been spending most of our time in the planning tab, and we know which tab or menu item we're on by the dark green color. And then we can enter records in the obviously an aptly titled records tab. And we can also enter records through farm assets. The 2 main differences between the 2 is that in records, you kind of enter records by record type. And in farm assets, you can enter all your records by field. And we'll go over how to do both these things. But we'll start with records, the records tab first. So we'll click that. And you can see in my account, right, because I've done some planning, I already have some records that have showed up, right? So you should see your fertilizer analysis, your soil tests, and your manure tests. GoCrop also tries to pull like the last couple of records, years for your plan. And so we can see that it's showing all my records that I've entered for 2026 and any that I've entered for 2025. But for you going forward into 2026, hopefully you will be keeping records in GoCrop. It's really handy that you can enter records into GoCrop throughout the year, so that when it comes to update your plan in the fall of this coming year or next winter, that's a huge portion that will help you move through your planning process a little bit faster. So to add a record, we'll press the plus new record button. And then once I do that, you can see that all my records that I just saw on that big screen have shifted to the left. I'm just going to leave those here for now. Now we have this drop down menu. If I click the drop down menu, I can see all my different types of records I can add. My fertilizer analysis, which you're familiar with from entering into your planning process, fertilizer applications, your harvest records, manure applications, manure tests, which you've also already entered into the planning process, pest control records, scouting records, seeding records, soil test import, which we've already covered, tillage record, and the weather record. I think the records I'd like to go over today are the fertilizer application record, the harvest record, the manure application record, and the weather record. Those are the most often used records. If you have questions about using any of the others, please feel free to reach out. So I will choose my fertilizer application record, and once I choose that, I can choose my location. I'll put my record date in. I'm going to throw it into the future just for fun here. And then we'll choose our application type for our fertilizer. These are default menu options for application type. So you might see that I have starter as an application type, and you might also have a fertilizer named starter. That's fine. You get to choose that later, what your fertilizer choice is. And some of these might be a little bit redundant, right? Like you might broadcast your side dress, or you might be like, well, what's the difference between top dress and side dress? Just please choose the one that makes the most sense for you and the type of application that you're putting in. For me, I'm going to say this is a starter, and then we'll choose the fertilizer. And now from this fertilizer drop-down menu, these are the fertilizers that you've entered into your plan. So if you're here and you want to add a fertilizer type that you don't see, you've got to go back to your plan and add it in. And of course, if you're going to add in a new fertilizer type or nutrient source that is a fertilizer, don't forget to add in your analysis. I'll add my starter fertilizer type, nitan, and then I'll choose recorded as. Am I going to do it as a rate, like how many gallons or tons per acre? Am I going to do it as a total? How much should I put down on that particular field, or loads? Loads, if you choose loads, then you'll choose a spreader. For me, and applying my nitan to my field, I'm going to click rate. I'm going to say it's about 10 gallons per acre, and my incorporation will say it was injected. You choose injected, your time to incorporation. defaults to immediate. If you choose any of the other options, you can choose either hours or days and put in the time. And then also enter in your soil moisture. You might wonder, well, why do I need to enter in soil moisture if I'm applying fertilizer? Part of this is connected to the required agricultural practices, and they require that soil moisture be captured in record keeping at time of either fertilizer or manure application. So once you put in your fertilizer application, you'll click save. And now we come back to that record screen and I can add a new record. And I'm going to continue on to show you what it looks like to add a manure application record. To do that, right, I'm going to press the record button in the upper right. Again, I'm going to choose from my drop-down menu. I'm going to choose manure application. I'm going to choose my field. I'm going to enter my date. And then we'll put the manure applied. And again, this is from your manure source, so that you've entered into your planning. So maybe you've added a stack in 2026 you weren't expecting to later than when you had created your plan, and you don't see that in your manure source. You'll just need to go back to planning, enter that in. Don't forget to also add your analysis. And then just like we saw in fertilizer, right, we can choose by rate, total, or loads. And in this example, I'm going to choose loads, and I'll choose my spreader, and then I'll enter the total number of loads that went onto the field. And then just like we did for fertilizer, we also enter in what our incorporation method is. This example, I'll choose chisel, and then I can choose my time to incorporation, like I tried to show you in fertilizer, either in hours or days. And again, it's soil moisture, and I'll just leave that as moist, but you have other options such as dry, slightly moist, wet, frozen, snow covered, or unknown. And once we enter a record, we can see that we've got some other information that shows up in our record snapshot summary, right? Like our fertilizer type, our manure source, the location, and the amount applied. So it's pretty handy to see right there. I'll add my next record here as an example. We'll just keep scrolling down through this. I'm going to now enter a harvest record. And just like we did for everything else, right, we are going to choose our location. We're going to put in our harvest date. Go crop is already saying, okay, we think that this is probably a hay field that you are harvesting from based off of the date, based off of the location for the plan that we've made. And so that'll just be there for you. You may have a couple of crops on your field, especially if you're rotating. Maybe you're going from hay to corn and you're going to take a first cut of hay followed by corn. Then you would choose which crop was most applicable in this drop-down menu. And then we record as total, load, sales, or bushels. In this example, we'll say we're taking bales of hay. It asks for the number of bales of hay, the average size of a bale of hay, weight really, and then the unit, if you're thinking about that in tons, pounds, or wet tons. If you do choose wet tons, then you have the opportunity to put in your dry matter. And then we'll click save, and that is our harvest record. And the last record I want to show you before we move on is the weather record. Weather records are important for are required as a part of the required agricultural practices for applications of fertility. And we have what you need here to capture that. So again, you'll choose the date. You'll choose either all fields, a group of fields, or a specific field. This is really nice, right? If you're applying to multiple fields on the same day and you want one weather record associated with all of them, you can choose a group of fields, which apparently we don't have right here. I'll do all fields, and then we'll put in our temperature. We'll default to Fahrenheit, but you can change this to Celsius if you want. Cloud cover, clear, partly cloudy, or overcast. These are defaults put in that are part of the required agricultural practices. If there's any precipitation, there's none. You don't have any other options to enter anything. If there's a little bit, then you can choose enter in the amount, and you have your option of putting that in inches or centimeters. Once you've completed the form, you can click save, and now we have a weather record. So the weather record's really nice because you can apply it to all fields at once, and it'll associate that weather record with any applicable fertility application. One really neat, I should say, useful feature of record keeping is the ability to copy. So you might have a fertilizer application on your diamond field, and you had the same applications on multiple other fields. So one thing you can do is you can click this little check mark over here, and now we have some other options. I can edit it, which would be just editing this exact record that I've created, or I can duplicate it. If I duplicate it, then I'm basically copying it, but it just shows me the duplicated form in its entirety. So it's the exact same thing I had for the diamond field, but now I want to also apply it to my square field, for example. And then GoCrop will keep everything else for me, the record date, the application type, fertilizer, and so on. And you can make any changes that you need to here. Maybe you have the same rate, but the date was different. And then you can click save to make sure you've saved that record for your, in this case, for my rectangle field, which we can, or sorry, my square field, which we can see right here, what I had just entered. You can also do this for manure applications and harvest records as well. You can kind of apply that forward. The other way that you can enter records is through farm assets. And so to do that, we can go to our farm assets tab here, right? And our farm assets again, right, shows us what our farm assets are, which are our field, manure sources, fertilizers, and spreaders. I just want to see what our fields are. So I'm going to get rid of everything else, get rid of that noise. I'm going to choose a field, right? And now I have these three sub tabs within my farm assets. And I can kind of toggle between all my fields on the sides here within assets. So I'm in my diamond field, I can see the details, I can see what my plan is, and I can also enter records. And entering records is pretty handy here because when I hit new record, and I see the same thing, right? I've got a drop down. I can choose, fertilizer application, for example. And it now, because I'm in my assets on a field, the record automatically populates my location. And then I fill in the rest just like I would from the general records tab. So I think that this view can be really helpful if you're keeping records on a piece of paper and you're keeping them by field. So you can just kind of stay in your field and enter your records that way. And the other thing that I wanted to show you while we're on this page is that there is this really neat little toggle button here that we don't see anywhere else. So you're probably familiar with this like 3 dots and the 3 lines, and that's our list view of our records. In this example, we also go back to our list view and certain steps in the planning process. But then we also have this little like weighing scale balance situation. And this is really nice because when we click this, now we see our nutrient balance of applied nutrients. So this is your balance of nutrients according to the records that you've entered. And it's going to be a really helpful view if you are, changed a planned application for whatever reason, and you need to make some changes and to see what those changes can be to make up for the remaining nutrients that you may need to apply. So in this example, right, we can see that I've got my fertilizer from May 20th here, and it contributed 35 pounds per acre of nitrogen, and I've got 114 more to meet that balance. So again, just to reiterate, this nutrient balance table, something you probably remember looking at in your planning, you're probably going to look at more of today, but this here is based off of your records. We're in the records tab. So don't get confused here, right? Like don't end up coming to your farm assets, hit records, and then start entering in records thinking that they're plans. Like we see that sometimes they're two separate things. And just to kind of drive this point home, you're entering a record when you're asking for a specific date, like May 20th, 2026. You're in the plan function when it says something like early, mid, or late May of this plan year. So just to kind of help keep those things separate. Sometimes people get a little bit, enter things in the different places than they mean to. I think the other thing I want to talk about in records before we move on and you can begin planning is looking at your reports for your records. So define those, right? You're going to go to planning. You'll go into the plan of the records that you want to view or reports that you want to generate. I'm going to go to our report tab. And then we can scroll down here and we have two different options. One is our record summary. We can click that to see what our record summary is. It's a shortened version of any single record you might have entered. And then we see, our records listed here, or sorry, our fields listed and as the columns, and then the type of records and some quick information about them in the rows. The more record types you have, the more rows you'll have. The more fields you have, the more pages you'll have. So I'm going to go back to my report page. You look at the record summary. And then one of the other pieces too, right, is that just for some context, we have individual field reports here, and that is by plan, where in each P index is entered there by plan as well. But if you also wanted a quick look at what your P index is based off of the records to date, we also have a report for that. And this is that P index report that we saw before last week, but for the plan, but this is just for the record. So it's a little bit incomplete, right? Like this will change throughout the year as you're adding more and more records, but this is a nice little snapshot to see that information. And then the other way that we can look at records in our report tab is scrolling down here. We have our field record log. And we can generate each one of the field record logs independently here in our default report page. Just to see what that looks like, we'll open one up here. And now we can see just a different layout of our summary of each one of the records we've entered and some more detailed information about it, right? Like now we can see like what the analysis of nighttime is, whereas before we couldn't see that in the summary. It's also space to see seeding records, harvest records, pest scouting records, and so forth on for one field. So each field has a page of records compared to our summary log, which was multiple fields on one page. If you want to generate your entire field log report for all of your fields, which you probably will at the end of next year, you'll come to, we were in generate, we're going to go to customize, and we'll generate a customized report for that. And so to do that, we'll deselect all our individual farm reports, we'll deselect all our individual field reports, and to generate just our field record log report, we'll check this button here next to the field record log title. We'll scroll back up to the top, say generate custom. And now instead of just showing one report at a time, like I showed you earlier, we can now see all our field records by field in the field record log. The last thing I want to show you that's not in GoCrop is, and you might be familiar with this, but it's our nutrient management planning for our team, Northwest Crops and Soils. And part of why I wanted to bring this up now is because I thought I might forget in a couple of weeks when we meet again. But this is a really great website that hosts a bunch of the information that we've been going over through the entire course. Part of our nutrient management plan, if you want to see creating a new plan, GoCrop tutorial that we made earlier this year, or an NMP update tutorial that we also made, feel free to look at those. Some of the pieces of these tutorials might be out of date because we have made some changes to GoCrop, and I will continue to send out updates as they happen in GoCrop to keep you up to date on what's going on and what to expect. We're constantly trying to make improvements and fixing bugs. That said, also I should have a plug too, say if you come across a bug or something doesn't seem to be flowing the way you expect it to, please feel free to reach out to either me personally or our GoCrop support email address, or call our office and we'll help get you set up. The other thing that we created this year, which I'm really excited about, I think it's been really, really helpful, we've got these tutorials, we've done those every year, but now we have this GoCrop user manual that you can download. I'm going to click that. And it's pretty long, but it's also really well curated, really well labeled. So if you've got a question on anything in particular, there's a page number for it. Really great explanations, and also lots of screenshots to help walk you through questions you might have or issues you might be experiencing, just to troubleshoot things as they come up in GoCrop. So I want to let you know this is a resource here for you, and also we are here in the office, a phone call or an email away, so feel free to reach out to us here as well. I think that covers it, but I'm happy to stay on. I know some other folks are on too, if there's any questions.